It was mid-January when Eric decided to escape to his family's cabin in northern Minnesota. The cabin sat on 40 acres of untouched forest, miles away from the nearest town. To most people, it might seem like the perfect retreat. No distractions, no noise, just peace. But Eric wasn't so sure. The last time he had visited was as a teenager, and he remembered his grandparents' hushed warnings about the woods at night. They used to say strange things happened in the deep of winter, during the first heavy snowfall. But back then, he'd chalked it up to old superstitions. Now, as an adult, he dismissed those warnings entirely. He needed solitude to clear his head after a nasty breakup and a year of stress at work. The cabin itself was rustic, but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, thick wooden beams, and an old generator to keep the power running. By the time Eric arrived, snow had already piled knee-deep around the cabin, and the forecast called for several more inches. He didn't mind. He brought books, food, and a satellite phone, just in case. The first 2 days passed quietly. Eric spent his time hiking through the woods and enjoying the serene beauty of the snowfall. But even during the day, the silence felt unnatural. There were no birds chirping, no rustle of animals in the underbrush, just the muffled crunch of his boots in the snow. That night, as Eric sat by the fire with a book, he heard something strange, a faint tapping at the kitchen window. He froze, listening carefully. It was rhythmic and deliberate, not the random scratching of a branch. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the window. He shone his flashlight into the darkness outside, but there was nothing there, just the snow falling steadily. When he opened the door to investigate, the bitter cold took his breath away. The tapping had stopped, and the only sound was the faint whistle of the wind. He looked down and saw them, footprints leading from the tree line straight to the kitchen window. They were large, too large to be a person's, with claw-like impressions where toes should have been. They stopped a few feet from the window and didn't lead back into the woods. It was as if the thing had simply disappeared. Eric bolted the door and checked every lock in the cabin. He convinced himself it was just a trick of the snow, a distortion in the ice or something his mind had exaggerated. Still, he kept a hunting knife on his nightstand that night and didn't sleep well. The next morning, the footprints were gone, erased by fresh snowfall. Eric felt a bit foolish for how paranoid he had been. He decided to go for a hike to clear his mind, venturing deeper into the woods than he had before. About an hour in, he noticed something strange. The trees around him were scarred, as though something had clawed at them. Deep gouges ran through the bark in long parallel lines. They were too high to have been made by a bear or any other animal he could think of. Then he stumbled upon something worse. A dead deer, its body half buried in the snow. Its throat had been torn open, and the snow around it was stained dark red. There were no tracks leading to or from the carcass. The hairs on the back of Eric's neck stood up. He felt like he was being watched. The forest, so eerily quiet before, seemed to hum with an oppressive energy. He turned back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as he could without breaking into a run. That night, Eric barricaded the doors and windows with furniture. He built a fire and sat with his knife close at hand. The hours passed slowly, and just when he started to think he might have been overreacting, he heard it again. This time, it wasn't just at the kitchen window. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, like something, or multiple things, were circling him. Then came the thuds on the roof, heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. The ceiling creaked under the weight. Eric's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the ceiling, clutching the knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the power went out. The hum of the generator died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Eric tried the satellite phone, but the screen was dead, no power. The air inside the cabin felt colder, as if the fire wasn't enough to keep the chill at bay. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside the front door. Eric stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to move. When the first light of day broke through the trees, the noises stopped. He mustered the courage to peek outside. The scene that greeted him was worse than he could have imagined. The cabin was surrounded by footprints, hundreds of them. They came from every direction, some leading right up to the windows and door. But like before, they weren't all human. Some were impossibly large, others misshapen. Eric packed a bag as quickly as he could, grabbing only the essentials. He didn't care about the storm. He had to leave. As he trudged through the snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in his peripheral vision, a dark shape darting between the trees. The forest seemed to close in around him, the silence pressing on his ears like a heavy weight. When he finally reached the main road hours later, his legs were numb and his face burned from the cold. A passing snowplow driver spotted him and pulled over. "You shouldn't be out here," the driver said, his expression grim. "Folks around here know better than to stay in those woods during the first snowfall. That's when they're most active." Eric didn't ask who or what they were. He didn't want to know. He never went back to the cabin, but even now, years later, he sometimes hears that sound. And every time, he makes sure his doors are locked, and he prays that they don't find him again. It was late December when Natalie and her boyfriend, Kevin, decided to spend a weekend at his uncle's cabin in the Rockies. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway from the chaos of the holidays. Just the two of them, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and tall evergreens. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built decades ago and maintained only during hunting season. It sat at the edge of a frozen lake, a postcard-perfect scene under the pale glow of the winter sun. The nearest neighbor was a half-hour drive away, and the dirt road leading to the cabin was so buried in snow that they had to hike the last mile with their supplies. Kevin's uncle had warned them about the cold and the isolation. "If the weather turns, stay inside. Don't try to hike out in a storm," he had said. Natalie thought he was being overly cautious. She had grown up in snowy winters. How bad could it be? The first day was peaceful. They spent it unpacking, cooking a warm dinner, and sipping wine by the fireplace. That night, as they lay in bed, Natalie thought she heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like a distant crunch, like footsteps on the snow. She brushed it off as a trick of the wind and drifted to sleep. The next morning, Natalie woke to an unsettling sight. There were tracks in the snow outside the cabin, leading from the edge of the woods to the back door. Kevin laughed it off, suggesting it was a deer or some other animal, but Natalie wasn't so sure. The tracks were too large to belong to a deer, and the pattern didn't look like hooves or paws. They looked like elongated footprints, almost human, but wrong somehow. Kevin dismissed her concerns and spent the afternoon chopping wood while Natalie read by the fire. The tracks seemed to fade from her mind as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. But that night, the noises returned. It started with the wind howling through the trees, but beneath it, Natalie could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping at the bedroom window. She nudged Kevin awake, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and got up to check. Pulling the curtain aside, he shone a flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there but swirling snowflakes. "It's probably a branch," he muttered, crawling back into bed. Natalie wanted to believe him, but the sound continued. Soft, deliberate taps, as if something was testing the glass. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. The next morning, Natalie found Kevin outside, staring at the snow near the cabin. His face was pale. "You need to see this," he said. More tracks had appeared overnight, circling the cabin in erratic loops. Some led to the windows, others to the front and back doors. But what unnerved them most was how fresh the tracks were. It hadn't snowed during the night, so whatever had made them was out there while they slept. Natalie wanted to leave immediately, but Kevin insisted they stay. "It's probably some weird animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll stay one more night and leave in the morning." Reluctantly, Natalie agreed, but the day dragged on with an oppressive sense of dread. They locked all the doors and windows before nightfall, barricading them with furniture just to be safe. The cabin felt like a fortress, but Natalie's unease only grew as darkness fell. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift in ways that didn't feel natural. Then, just past midnight, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder and more persistent, moving from window to window around the cabin. Natalie clutched Kevin's arm, her breath hitching in her throat. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing a flashlight and a hunting knife. "Don't go out there," Natalie begged, but he shook his head. Kevin stepped outside, the cold rushing in as he opened the door. Natalie watched from the window as his flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the snow. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, Kevin froze. "Natalie?" His voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Kevin didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at something in the distance. Natalie followed his gaze and saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and slightly bent. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to blend into the snowy backdrop. But its eyes were the worst part. They glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that pierced the darkness like two lanterns. The figure didn't move, but Natalie felt its gaze locked on them. "Get inside," she screamed, pulling Kevin back into the cabin. They slammed the door and shoved the furniture back into place. For the rest of the night, the tapping continued, now accompanied by soft scratching sounds at the walls. The figure never approached the cabin, but its presence lingered, an unrelenting weight pressing down on them. When dawn finally came, the noises stopped. Kevin and Natalie didn't wait another second. They grabbed their bags and bolted for the car, trudging through the snow as fast as they could. When they reached the trailhead, they found the windshield of their car covered in frost, but not from the cold. Someone or something had written a single word in the ice. "Watching!" They didn't speak during the drive back to town. When Kevin's uncle asked why they were back early, they just said the weather had been too much to handle. But Natalie knew they'd been lucky to leave when they did. Whatever had been watching them in the woods wasn't finished. And every winter, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls, she remembers those glowing yellow eyes and wonders if it's still out there, waiting for her to come back. Lena and Mark had always talked about escaping the daily grind of city life for a weekend, but with both of them working demanding jobs, finding the time had always been difficult. However, when the holidays rolled around and the opportunity finally presented itself, they jumped at the chance to retreat to a cabin far away from the noise of the world. Mark had found the cabin online. It was a small, rustic place, nestled in the northern woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor, and surrounded by the kind of isolation that both drew them in and made them a little uneasy. They figured it would be a perfect getaway, just the two of them. No distractions, no interruptions. The drive was longer than anticipated. The forecast had promised light snowfall, but as they neared the cabin, the storm worsened. Snow fell heavier, and the wind howled, creating a blizzard that seemed to swallow the road ahead. Mark's truck struggled in the deepening snow, tires spinning occasionally as the vehicle's headlights barely cut through the thick, swirling storm. They passed no other cars, no signs of life, nothing but the endless stretch of white and black. "We might have made a mistake, Lena," Mark said, his voice tinged with concern. He wasn't a fan of long, isolated drives in bad weather, and the lack of any sign of civilization for miles wasn't helping his nerves. Lena glanced over at him, trying to smile, though her own unease had begun to rise. "It'll be worth it. You said you wanted peace and quiet, didn't you?" He gave a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a tension in the air now, an uncomfortable silence that hung between them as they drove deeper into the woods. The storm had reduced visibility to near zero, and the snow was beginning to accumulate rapidly around them. After what seemed like an eternity, the headlights finally caught the faint outline of the cabin up ahead. The place was small, but charming, built from dark wood and stone, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch on forever. There was a faint glow from inside, indicating that the cabin was already warmed by the fire. Mark parked the truck, and the two of them stepped out into the freezing cold. The snow crunched loudly under their boots as they hurried toward the cabin, eager to escape the harsh elements. Inside, the warmth of the fire embraced them immediately. The flickering flames danced in the stone fireplace, casting a golden light across the cozy interior. Wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and rustic furniture lined the room, old but comfortable. The smell of pine and wood smoke hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of something old and dusty. Lena felt a sense of nostalgia as she stepped further into the cabin. It reminded her of the small retreats she had visited as a child, though she couldn't quite place why. Mark, on the other hand, seemed more skeptical. He quickly started unpacking their bags and moved to stoke the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows, making the entire structure creak and groan under the pressure. Despite the warmth inside, Lena felt a chill in the air that she couldn't quite shake. "This place feels a little off, don't you think?" Mark said after a while, his voice low as if testing the air for anything else. Lena gave him a skeptical look. "It's just the storm. The wind's making the house settle. It's an old cabin. You're hearing things." But the unease continued to build inside her. The house felt too quiet, too still. After a quick dinner and a couple of glasses of wine, they tried to settle in for the night. But the wind outside only grew louder, battering against the walls and windows. It wasn't unusual for a storm to make strange sounds, but something about the noises outside made Lena's skin crawl. Every now and then, she thought she heard a faint tapping, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a knuckle against glass. At first, she told herself it was just the storm, but the longer the sound persisted, the more unsettling it became. "Mark, do you hear that?" she asked, glancing nervously around the room. Mark looked up from his book, his face shadowed by the low light of the fire. "It's just the wind," he said, though his words seemed uncertain. The tapping continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the back window. Lena got up slowly and moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing but the swirling snowstorm outside. But there, standing just beyond the small porch, was a figure, a silhouette against the white backdrop. It was tall, thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The figure was perfectly still, its face obscured by a mass of snow and shadows. Lena froze, staring at it, her breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she whispered, voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Mark jumped up and rushed to her side. He peered through the window, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see. But when he looked out, there was nothing. The figure had vanished. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice sounding more dismissive than he probably meant. "You're imagining it. It's the snow and the wind playing tricks on you." Lena shook her head. "I swear, I saw someone. It was right there." Mark gave a strained smile. "It's probably just a shadow. There's nothing out there, Lena. Let's just go to bed, okay?" Despite her growing anxiety, Lena reluctantly agreed. She didn't want to argue, and Mark was clearly trying to calm her down. They locked all the doors and windows, made sure the fire was stoked, and settled under the blankets in the warmth of the cabin. But sleep didn't come easy. By midnight, the storm had escalated. The wind howled louder than before, rattling the windows with a force that felt unnatural. Lena lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the image of the figure standing outside. The tapping had returned, but now it was joined by a strange dragging sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground, slow and deliberate. Suddenly, there was a loud thud at the door. Lena's heart leapt into her throat, and she sat straight up in bed. Mark stirred beside her, but he was too groggy to process the noise. Another thud, then another. The scraping noise began again, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something pressing against the walls. "Mark!" Lena gasped, shaking him harder. "Something's out there!" Mark bolted upright, his eyes wide with alarm. He got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight that they had left by the bedside table. Without a word, he moved toward the door, cautiously unlocking it and pulling it open a crack. The cold air rushed in like a slap to the face, and the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow. He stepped outside, scanning the area, but there was no sign of movement, just the snow, swirling in the wind. Lena stood by the door, fear creeping up her spine as she waited. A minute passed, and then another. Mark stepped back inside, his face pale. "There's nothing," he muttered, but the way his hands trembled betrayed his fear. "We're going to stay inside tonight. No more going out there." They locked the door again and barricaded the windows, but the sounds outside only grew more unsettling. The scraping, dragging noises continued, now accompanied by soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to float through the storm, like they were coming from all directions. By the third night, the storm was relentless. The snow piled up around the cabin, nearly blocking the windows. Mark and Lena spent the day inside, trying to keep warm and distracted, but their nerves were shot. The sounds from the previous nights were unbearable now, intensifying with each passing hour. That night, the tapping returned again, louder, more insistent, followed by the scratching against the wood. But this time, it wasn't just coming from one direction. It was coming from all sides, from the back of the cabin, the windows, even the roof. It was as if something, or someone, was surrounding them. The back door suddenly shook violently, as if something was trying to break it down. The wind had died down slightly, but the eerie silence that followed was worse than the storm itself. Then, the scraping sound returned, but this time it was followed by something more disturbing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps moving around the cabin. Lena grabbed Mark's arm, her heart racing. "We have to leave, now." Mark nodded, fear evident in his eyes. They scrambled to gather their things, but the footsteps outside were growing closer, coming toward the front door now. The tapping was joined by a louder pounding thud, as if something large and heavy was throwing itself against the cabin. They rushed to the truck, the snow now waist-high. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he started the engine. The truck roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the cabin behind. But as they looked back through the rearview mirror, Lena thought she saw something, someone, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them as they drove away. The pale figure, its long arms stretched unnaturally toward the truck, its hollow eyes fixed on them. They never spoke of what happened again.